In the 1950s and early 60s, when I was a child and a young adolescent, my family had one focal point on Sunday: getting to church. That was a major task for us because there were 9 of us, and many of those 9 were very young. My father, who was never ever late, would sit in the car, smoking, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, while I and my mother tore around the house finding clean socks, matching shoes, hats, coats, baby bottles, small quantities of Cheerios, and boredom control for the pre-literate contingent. Inevitably, we did make it to church, and all the way through the service, and then the big, and I mean really, really big question was, were we going to the drugstore? We hardly ever dared utter the question lest we seemed too presumptuous. Why did we go to the drugstore, do you think? Mostly, I suppose, because it was all that was open for business on Sunday. Those were the last days of the blue laws in Illinois before the advent of the open all day and night mania came to us. And this is the legacy of the old Puritan influence in the US, that the observance of the Sabbath was based on a very reductionistic, almost self-hating concept of fasting from work. No laughter, no games, no visiting. And in this way, people enslaved their minds, muted their imagination, and merely waited out the time till they could get back to work. Well, I submit to you that this kind of fasting, from community, from nature, from imagination, from the arts, from beauty, from all that lifts our souls to God, is not what is meant by keeping holy the Sabbath. Why did we want to go to the drugstore? There were no books, no toys, no games, no kid-friendly items except chocolate. Chocolate bars, chocolate-covered nuts, soft chocolate creams and chews in pretty boxes, and even frozen chocolate ice cream bars. And so we went to church quietly, obediently, and hopefully dreaming of chocolate. The ecstasy of chocolatey goodness was not precisely what is meant in the book of Exodus when we read, "The seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or your female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident," and the alien resident is, the seasonal worker, "in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all it is in them, but rested the seventh day and consecrated it." When we meet the Israelites today in the text from Isaiah, they are not having trouble consecrating the seventh day to their worship. They worship for sure, but they're missing the deeper intention of the commandment. Isaiah accuses them of acting as though it's enough to worship on the Sabbath and ignore God's purposes for the rest of the week. To hold to the Sabbath is to do 2 things: to rest the seventh day and carry out God's purpose the rest of the days. To rest is to ensure that everybody puts aside the anxiety and toil and work so that everyone may spend time in joyful reflection of the time of God, or as we more often say it, thinking about heaven. The first intention of the Sabbath rest is to free the mind and spirit by engaging in restful, recreative, communal, playful activity to soothe and to refresh. Because only when we're free from the anxiety of toil, can we open our imagination to the possibility, to the newness, to the infinite diversity of the universe. Only in this creative, open state can we see the interconnectedness, the interdependence of all people and all creation. In our post-capitalist society, we are collapsing in on ourselves with anxiety and hate. We are restless and tormented. Our neighbors have become our enemies. The refugee has become a threat. Perhaps in the greatest irony, the idea of finding peaceful solutions for the common good, as in putting on masks or putting aside assault weapons, has turned into the sense of being robbed of one's rights. And all of this is superimposed on our complete dedication to extraordinary consumerism. This generates an enormous degree of worry and cynicism, and when it boils over, it becomes violence. But there is an antidote. The antidote for despair and anxiety is Sabbath. Keeping Sabbath is much more than going to church on Sunday. The command to keep Sabbath came to the Israelites after the Exodus. The Israelites understood the Exodus to be the action of God to remove them from the economic and legal oppression by Pharaoh. It was not metaphoric, it was real. Pharaoh, whose production was completely dependent on the utilization of Israelite slave labor. The Sabbath, therefore, is not only a day of gratitude and praise, but also of active rejection of any economy which oppresses the many in favor of the few. In the words of the eminent and beloved Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, it is an act of resistance and inclusion. Resistance to economic injustice and inclusion of everyone in the community of God. The great theologian Abraham Heschel talks about the belief that in each of us at our birth, there is the seed of paradise, which I think is an amazingly beautiful idea. In each of us, there is the potential for perfect union, not only with God, but with each other in God. And we are given this seed of paradise, this potential, this longing, with the free will to do whatever we please with it. But we are told throughout scriptures that the God who made us also gave us the command to keep Sabbath in order to help us nurture and celebrate and sanctify this seed of heaven throughout our lives. Why? So that we may have the capacity to enter paradise at the end of our days, when we leave our time and enter God's time. We will have the capacity to experience God in God's time. So, as we know, in paradise there's no need for anxiety because there is no scarcity, no competition for resources, no power imbalance. But if we spend our lives training our minds to believe that there's not enough to go around, that we must never take our eyes off the ball or we will fall apart, our minds will be unable to comprehend what it means to be unified in God. The Sabbath, then, is a fast from those things which bind us to this space and keep our minds from soaring into God's life. So to consecrate the Sabbath, we worship together, absolutely, but we also need to listen to music, to walk in nature, to read beautiful literature, to watch absorbing films, to have parties, to play games, to eat good food. In these joyful pursuits, we celebrate life. We celebrate God's life in us. We celebrate the seed of paradise within us. And this is the sad thing about the blue laws and my childhood Sunday drugstore visits. That somehow in those days we thought that keeping holy the Sabbath meant having no fun, meant punishing children for wanting just to have a chocolate day. If we live completely in God and the Sabbath lives in us, then we will also live in the pursuit of the interests of God, which are, as we so often have heard, to offer food to the hungry, satisfaction to the afflicted, especially the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. Jesus healed the woman's spine because Jesus did live completely in God, in God's interests, in God's eternity, where there are no health concerns. We might say that Jesus helped her to find the divine spark, the seed of paradise within her, because creativity and wonder will banish the demons of worry and cynicism, which bind the body and hijack the mind. So, On this beautiful and happy day, when we are together, listening to good music, praying beloved prayers, breaking bread together, let us celebrate the Sabbath. Let us remember that we are, after all, a congregation dedicated to pursuing the interests of God in the world, to welcoming, to feeding, to comforting, to freeing, to housing, to advocating. I am deeply grateful for all your deep and abiding commitment to the observance of the Sabbath commandment. And I pray you feel the blessing that you are to so many people.